Yes! We are building a golf simulator PC today, so basically this video is for all the old white people with way too much time and money on their hands. I'm just joking, guys. Every time I go to the golf course, I always see old white people with way too much time and money. All jokes aside, guys, this is for anyone and everyone who's thinking about building a PC for their golf simulator. Now, you might be wondering, well, can I just buy an iPad or an iPad Pro and run software off of there? It'll be much more portable, about the same price, and it's true. But the problem is, like, one of the biggest golf game softwares out there, TGC 2019, it cannot run on an iPad or iOS or Mac. It must run on a PC. The second reason why you might want to build a PC is because with an iPad, when you display out, you might run into resolution issues on your projector, so the PC gives you a little bit more flexibility. This is meant to be a budget-friendly build. However, I do want to keep things small and compact. Like, look how small this case is over here. But unfortunately, in the PC building world, to keep things small and compact does come at a premium. Now, this stuff that you see here is going to cost you about $1,000, but you can still keep things small and compact for about $300 to $350 less. And I'll talk about where you can save money along the way. The reason why mine costs as much as it does is because a lot of brands sent this stuff over to me, which I'm super thankful for. I'll just give one example. This here is a RAM kit, a 16 gigabyte RAM kit sent over by Team Force. Thank you so much, Team Force, by the way. However, for a golf simulator PC, you really only need 8 gigabytes. So that's like $40 to $60 saved already. The case that I'm using is the iQnix ZX1. This is an ITX case, ITX meaning small form factor. There is a much cheaper alternative at less than half the price. It's also an ITX case called the Cooler Master NR200. I did a full build guide in it, but before you click away, make sure you jot down this part list because that PC cost me about $3,000. You want to find out what parts I'm using and then use that build guide. For the motherboard, I'm using the ASRock Z590M ITX. If you're going to build an ITX PC, you do need an ITX motherboard. A cheaper alternative would be the MSI MPG B560i Gaming Edge Wi-Fi Gaming Motherboard M-ITX. It's a mouthful. I'll link everything down in the description below. My processor of choice for this build is the Intel i3-10105F. Now keep in mind that if you opt to go with a different processor, you must make sure your motherboard is compatible with it. The CPU coolers that you can use in this case are pretty limited. The one that I'm using is a great budget pick, the Scythe Big Shuriken 3. Huge shout out to Scythe for sending that over. The golf software that I'm gonna be running is TGC 2019, and it is probably the most graphics hungry game out there. It actually recommends a GTX 1060. However, those cost $300 to $400 right now, which is more than I wanna spend on a golf PC. So I actually went with the GTX 770. You can pick this up for about $150 to $200 used. They don't make these new anymore. Team Force generously sent over 1 terabyte of their Delta Max SATA solid state drive. However, for a small form factor build, I highly recommend you go with something like this instead. This is an M.2 NVMe drive, and the reason why I recommend this and only 500 gigabytes at maximum, you can even probably get away with 250 gigabytes, is because with this, you have no additional cables. This attaches directly to your motherboard. With a SATA drive like this, there are 2 additional cables, and in a small form factor build, you want to get rid of as many cables as possible. The best power supply for an ITX case and one of this fairly low power is the Corsair SF450. Corsair's power supplies have the best flexible cables, which is perfect in a small form factor case. However, I already had the Cooler Master V850 SFX on hand, so that's the one I'm going to be using. This build isn't going to get super hot. It's not ridiculously powerful, but I do recommend getting a couple fans to help air circulate. So in this case, I can fit 2 of Scythe's 120mm case flex fans, which are great budget fans, again sent over by Scythe. If you're going to use 2 case fans like I am, I also recommend you get a PWM fan splitter. It's just going to help with cable management in a small case. The only tool you really need is a high quality screwdriver kit so you don't strip any screws, and the other tools I believe come with the iQnix. You also might want to get some zip ties to help you cable manage. I'm not too worried about cable management in this case because both sides are covered, so aesthetically it's not going to look too ugly, and also because it's not super powerful, I'm not worried about those cables getting in the way of airflow like I would be on a higher end PC. The first thing we're going to do is breadboard the PC, which basically means we're going to build the PC outside of the case, because if something doesn't work, if there's a component that's failed, it's easier to replace it while it's all splayed out versus having to strip down and remove everything, especially from a small form factor case. These are all the components we're going to need to breadboard our PC. So here is my graphics card, my processor, my motherboard, my hard drive. This is an NVMe hard drive. I do have a regular SATA hard drive, but I'm not going to use it for the breadboarding portion. This is my CPU cooler with all the necessary components. I know that a lot of guys out there, if you're a guy building, a lot of guys don't like to read the manual. For PC building, you definitely want to keep those guides around. You definitely want to read those because just for example, take a look at this. Like look how confusing this is, and it comes with so many different pieces. You're going to want to make sure that you're reading this stuff through. So here in our case, we're using an LGA 1200 socket. So that's here, that's this part right here. So you're going to want to make sure you follow all those pieces and make sure you get the right components out for the CPU cooler. You're going to need thermal paste. A lot of times your coolers will come with one. This one did come with one, but I'm just using an aftermarket that I had on hand. This is all they had left at Micro Center. But to repeat, you do not need to buy this. It usually comes with your CPU coolers. You got your RAM over here and you've got your power supply over here. This and all the relevant power supply cables. This is the main power cable. This is the CPU cable that's gonna plug right into here. This is the 24 motherboard cable, which is gonna plug right into here. And this is our PCI Express. PCI Express means that it's gonna go into our graphics card over here into these slots once it's plugged into our motherboard. Starting with our CPU, you're gonna pick this up. Some of you guys are gonna have a black plastic shield here that covers all this up. Mine is a used motherboard, which is why that's gone. The person probably popped it out and it never really mattered. You're gonna leave that black part intact. You're gonna go ahead and unhook this. So it'll stay like this with the black piece on top. You're gonna unhook it by lifting this and just pulling it back. This part you wanna be very, 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 very careful about. These pins here are very fragile, and so if you drop something on it and it bends the pin, this motherboard is basically gonna be DOA. So what you're gonna wanna do is typically on the bottom left of your CPU, you're gonna see an arrow, and then you're gonna see another arrow on your motherboard CPU socket, which is right here. You're gonna wanna make sure that those two line up and very gently drop it into the socket. Again, very gently, make sure it drops in there. And you can just wiggle it from the outsides without any pressure, just wiggle it just to make sure that it's fully in and it's seated, and that's pretty much it. Then you can go ahead and drop this back in. And again, if you have a black piece, when you pull this down, there's gonna be a lot of pressure. It's gonna feel uncomfortable, but that black piece will pop off. In my case, again, I don't have a black piece, so I'm just gonna lock it like that. And that's it for the CPU. Simple, but take your time, be very careful. The next thing we're gonna do is install the NVMe drive. Now again, in your motherboard's manual, it's gonna tell you where those NVMe drives are located. And here it says M.21 and M.22. So in this case, we're gonna put in an M.21, which is the top one, but it's covered by the shield which says M.2 armor. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that with the 2 screws. And you're gonna find that under these things are typically these gel things. It's gonna have like a shrink wrap here. You wanna remove that. These are basically heat sinks for your drive because these things do get hot. So again, you're gonna see plastic shield here. Make sure you remove the one. If you don't have a second drive, then leave this one intact, but at least the one that's gonna cover it. The manual said that M.21 is on top, M.22 is the bottom one, so I'm gonna install it on the top. The way you do it is you're gonna see again this gap in teeth here and on the bottom. You're gonna insert it at an angle like this, like so, just till it's inside, and you lower it here, and then there's gonna be a screw inside of your motherboard box. You're gonna grab that and screw it in. It's gonna be a very, very, very small screw. It's only about this big here, and with that, you're gonna go ahead and put the shield back on. The next thing we're gonna do is our RAM. So with your RAM sticks, they're gonna go in these 2 sockets here. You wanna make sure that these tabs are open. Only one side opens, not both. So you wanna make sure that the shorter side goes on the bottom, because if you try to put it in here, you see the tooth is here. If you try to shove it in this way, you're gonna end up breaking this little insert chip here. So you gotta make sure that the smaller set of teeth are on the bottom. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna go ahead and put it inside both holes. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna put in one side at a time. So I'll start with the bottom side, and you'll hear a little click like that, and another click, just like that. Next, we're gonna go ahead and install our CPU cooler. You're gonna take the mounting bracket and you're gonna put it on the back side through the 4 holes. Next, you're gonna go ahead and put these little spacing things down. It says on the manual that the rubber should go face down. And then you're gonna go ahead and put these brackets on here, and it looks like the sharp teeth part of it are facing inwards. And then from here, we're gonna go ahead and screw this in. We're gonna install the CPU cooler next, but there's a couple things you gotta know. So the first thing is that underneath, this is the block that's gonna touch contact with your CPU, and here are the screws, and the screw holes are right here. The second thing is that there is a piece of shrink wrap here. I don't know exactly what you call this, but there's a piece of shrink wrap, and you're gonna have to peel that before you put it on. But before we do that, we're gonna need thermal paste that goes on the processor so that it allows cooling, and then this heatsink is gonna make contact with the cooler and basically dissipate the heat through these fins. So what we're gonna do first thing we're gonna have to do is put thermal cooling solution on here. There's a couple different ways people do this. This is a smaller LGA 1200, which means it's a perfect square, which means in these cases, I like to do a generous dot in the middle, but not something too crazy. There's been many tests. You can't really do too much, but if you do too much, it's just gonna be messy. So get an idea of here. Some people say like a rice grain. I'm gonna go a little bit bigger than that. So that's about what I'm gonna do there. I know that my placement that I want is I'm gonna have it about here. Also, there's a fan cable here because this fan needs to be plugged in. And again, check your motherboard for reference where your fan pins are. I know that my CPU fan is here. You wanna try to do this in one placement as much as possible so your grease doesn't move around too much. So I'm gonna try to line that up. You're gonna see these two holes where you can access the screw. So let me screw those in now. And when you screw this in, you don't wanna tighten one side all at once. You wanna do a little bit at a time on each side. And the reason why is because if you have unbalanced pressure, then it's going to not only potentially damage your parts, but your thermal grease won't spread evenly, like it'll all spread to one side versus being a nice mixture on both sides. So we're gonna go ahead and plug this fan cable in here. Next thing we're gonna do is plug in our graphics card, which is gonna go, again, the small pin here, long pin there. Make sure this is open by pulling it to the right. This can be closed like this or opened. And then you're gonna go ahead and just drop that right in. And there you've had it. You've pretty much built a PC at this point. So now we're gonna go ahead and plug in all the cables from here into our motherboard, and then we're gonna try to jump it to see if it works. There's gonna be two sides to these cables. One says CPU, one says CMPSU. CMPSU being Cooler Master Power Supply Unit. Gonna go ahead and plug the CPU side to the cable here, and then plug this into the part that says PCIe/CPU. Any of these are fine. Next thing, we're gonna take our 24-pin motherboard cable, put our 24-pin here, and then over here, you're gonna see an 18-pin motherboard and a 10-pin motherboard. This is your 10-pin, this is your 18-pin. Next is gonna be our graphics card cable. You wanna be a little careful with this because normally this is screwed down, and so this is being held on by a tiny little lip here, so just be very careful with this. The way this works is that this side goes to your power supply, and you've got two of these 8-pin cables here. What you're gonna do is you're gonna connect these two together like this, and then you're gonna go ahead and plug it in this way. And then with this one, only the 6-pin without the 2 needs to plug in. And then plug this again into that PCIe CPU socket. Then you're gonna take your power cable for your power supply, plug it in here, and then plug it into an outlet. Do not touch the power supply. It can be very dangerous. Obviously, you can hold it on the outside, but don't go sticking your fingers in places where there's clear shields meant for you not to stick your fingers in. So I've got my monitor over here. I'm gonna plug in a display cable, in my case, display port, to the graphics card, not to the motherboard here. And then the next thing we're gonna do is power on our power supply. There's 0 and there's 1. 1 means on, 0 means off. A lot of times people forget to do that and ends up not working. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna jump our PC to turn it on without a power button from a case. And the way you do that is you take something metal like your screwdriver here, and usually on the bottom right hand side, there are these 9 cables with a missing pin at the very bottom of this little 9 set. And the bottom 2 on the right are gonna be your power on switches. So you're gonna take something metal and you're gonna touch those 2 things together, and you'll see that it turns your computer on. The goal here is to see whether or not we can get to BIOS on the screen here. So this is exactly why we do breadboarding, because the PC will not post, meaning that when I turn it on, nothing will show up on the screen. So it turns out that the issue is actually the DisplayPort cable. I've noticed that with DisplayPort, sometimes there's a lag in the monitors, and what happens is when the PC boots and the DisplayPort cable doesn't read the signal in time, it'll just hang indefinitely. So nothing was posting. I replaced it with an HDMI cable and it works just fine. After you install Windows, DisplayPort should be just fine, but just keep that in mind that that might be the issue. I'm gonna go ahead and tear out what's not essential here, and then I'm going to go ahead and install it inside the case now. The other benefit of breadboarding a PC like this is that, one, you know how the general parts go. There's going to be a few other pieces, but I would say this is about 80% complete. And the other thing is that you don't have to remove like 50% of this stuff. The only things you're going to remove are any cables that are coming off of the motherboard, except for the fan cable, since that's connected to the cooler here. And you just remove the graphics card and then just drop it straight into the case. To remove the graphics card, you can take like a screwdriver. You're going to push down on that pin back here, kind of like what was on that RAM. On the far right side, you're gonna see this like black clip. You're gonna push that down so that it will open that slot. And with that being said, you can now lift the graphics card off of there, just like that. There's this little thing, you wanna push that, and then you wanna pull back and forth. And the last one is the CPU cable over here on the side. And you can leave this and drop this directly as is into the case. There's a couple things that's unique about this case. One of the things is that this instruction manual is amazing, and you should really take your time because it really gives you detailed step-by-steps on how to build this PC. You're not always gonna get this with most PCs, or there'll be some instruction sets, but it won't be nearly as detailed as this. And they also give you literally everything you need to build, including like a screwdriver kit. That's probably why this thing costs as much as it does. I've already removed these panels here. They were just simply pull it out with your hand. There's a couple of things that you gotta remove based on the instruction manual. So let me go ahead and remove those now. Now that everything's removed, the instruction manual tells me to take the power cable and then thread it through the bottom. Now it says put the PCI extension cable onto your motherboard. This board is a little bit different. Some smaller cases make you use an extension cable, which means that the graphics card will not be directly here. Instead, it's gonna be on the other side. As you can see, this is like a 2-area case. And so what's gonna happen is your motherboard will sit on this side, but your graphics card is gonna sit on that side. In order to make that work, you need an extension cable so that it routes under and your graphics card can sit there. You wanna undo this plastic piece here, toss that to the side, and you're gonna grab this and you're gonna drop it right into there. Make sure this clip is open. So before you install your IO shield, you need to know that the instruction manual tells you to put the graphics card slot on the top. This is not typical. Usually the graphics card slot will be on the bottom like this, but in this case, again, it being a small form factor, using a unique design, you're gonna have to put the graphics card up top. That means that your IO shield, you're gonna have to make sure that it aligns the holes. The other things that I noticed is that here on the bottom, when I try to insert this in, everything on the bottom here, basically you can't access anymore. And that's got a couple of issues. One is that one of the motherboard standoff screws is actually here, this hole. You can't access that. I'm not too worried. This is not that heavy. I think it's fine with the 3 screws, but the more important part is that my fan headers. This motherboard, small form factor motherboards have less fan headers than larger motherboards. And in my case, I have 3. I've got the CPU fan here, one right next to it, and the third one's already been hidden by the fan here under here. Instead of removing the whole cooler, I don't want to do that because then I'm going to have to remove the paste and everything. So instead, I'm going to get what you call a fan splitter. This is something that will go into a fan head and then split into 2 or 3, 4 different fans. I'm going to go ahead and plug that in here, and I'm going to take the CPU power cable and I'm going to connect it in advance because again, you cannot access this once it's inside. So now that all the cables are on, there's a couple things. One is that you want to tuck away the CPU fan cable if it's hanging down low like mine is. Otherwise, it's going to be hanging off. And then for the CPU and the fan splitter, you're gonna wanna make sure that they're popping out because you're gonna have very little space between here and this lip of the case here. So let me go drop that in. And also for the motherboard screws, they look like they've got little hoods on them. Be very, very, very slow and deliberate when you put these in because if you drop it, it's gonna get tucked under here and you're gonna have to pull the whole thing out to put another one of these in. And that's especially annoying when you've got 3 out of your 4 screws screwed in and then you lose one and you gotta rip the whole thing out. The next step tells me to turn this over and take the PCI Express extension cable here and go ahead and screw it down to these holes here. Just so that you guys are aware of what I'm doing, I plan to put 2 fans exhausting air out, pushing air out of the case, which is the reason why I need these 2. And once I tuck these pins in, I can then, I believe, hide this down in the slot below. Normally, you wouldn't be able to detach this from your PC, at least not intentionally. And then on top of that, you will see a whole bunch of cables coming down here that you plug into your motherboard. But this case is really nice in that it gives you options of whatever you want to use. So this, you can use this as a mass storage USB drive. This one here is going to be your front audio ports for your headphone, microphone. And then this is going to be your regular USB thumb drive. And you can attach or detach whatever cables you need. In my case, I'm not going to need a mass storage drive, so I'm just going to toss that there. I am going to need my front USB port just in case. And I honestly don't need my audio cable as well, because again, my audio is not going to be coming from here. It's going to be coming through the HDMI line from my projector. So I'm not going to need that either. So I'm just going to plug my USB port in. This is plugged in. Before I can go ahead and mount it back on top, there are these front power cables here. These power cables basically control, remember how we jumped the power earlier using our screwdriver? Well, this is gonna allow it to attach to our power button so that when we push it, the power will come on. And it doesn't have a reset switch, but you have 4 because one of them, these 2 are for power switch, and these 2 are gonna be for the LED to let you know that the computer's on. They're gonna go into this 9 thing that we saw earlier. And if you look here, this is what I'm talking about, onboarders, headers, and connectors. You're gonna see the 9 things here and the one missing here. So it tells you that right now I'm looking at it the wrong way and I have to flip it like this. With the one missing down on the bottom left, you've got the power button and the ground together, and then the LEDs go on the top left side, or my bottom left side here. And again, the orientation of positive and negative does not matter. Just take your time and just drop them into the little pins. Dan from the future here, make sure that before you install this plate on, you install your fans. I didn't do that. I'm gonna have to take it apart and install the fans, but let me talk about a little bit about the fan rationale that I'm gonna have here. I mentioned earlier that I want the two fans set into exhaust mode, and if you don't know what that means, it means that I want it to pull air out of the case and push it up like this. So it's gonna be pulling the air out and pushing it up. So the way you can tell which way the fan is, pushing air is look at the fins and the way they're facing and spin it. And put your hands on either side. Where is the air pushing towards? And in this case, it's gonna be this way. There's also some logo that's gonna tell you which way as well, but this is the way that I do it. So it's pushing air out this way, so I want it like this. And with the fan cable being on this side, I don't know if you can see that, camera's gonna see that, I want them facing this way so that the fan cable can slot down here and connect. Now the reason why I want it pushing air out is because think about the case design. Here it's a what do you call it? A perforated panel on both sides. So this, it's gonna be pulling air from outside in, fresh air outside in, but then where does all that hot air go? That's where these fans come in, where it's gonna push all that hot air out. Same with the graphics card. Graphics card is gonna be pulling air, fresh air from the outside, but where does all that hot air go? This fan is these two fans are gonna be helping push all that hot air out of the case, helping the case and all the components stay cool. So how do you install the fans? Place it just like this with the cable on this side, and then you have to install it from the bottom. And the screws that you use come with your fan box. So wherever box your fans came out of, you get these 4 big screws, and you see this rail here, you're gonna align the holes of the fan, and you're gonna screw it into those 4 rails. These rails are designed so that you can move it however you want. Let's say you just have one fan, you can move it more towards the middle or something like that, or even towards here, and then screw it in that way. It's really up to you. Because I have 2, I'm gonna put one here and probably one down towards here. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and screw this front panel in. I'm gonna flip it upwards, and if I remember correctly, it kind of goes down like this, and I'll screw in those screws that I had earlier. So you guys remember that front USB drive? You're gonna have a connector here. This goes onto a connector that's usually on the outside of your motherboard. If it was on this side, it'd be problematic. It usually never is. It's usually where your RAM is. So you're gonna make sure you find that little dent here, and you're gonna find a space on the outside of these pins, and you're gonna go ahead and drop it right into that slot. So remember how I said I was gonna show you guys how to put an M.2 drive in case you don't want to pick up an NVMe drive? Well, I found out that this is an RGB face, and it's much too pretty to just be sitting down here in a cold attic where my golf simulator is. So I'm gonna put this in another drive or another build, but true to my word, I'm gonna show you guys how this works. So the first thing you're gonna need is this cable here out of your power supply box, and you're gonna see that it's got a bunch of these thin connectors and then this little 5-pin here. This 5-pin will go into your power supply, and then one of these, it doesn't matter which, one of these things will go into the longer pin slot on your M.2 drive, just like this. Then you're gonna get this SATA cable. This is gonna come out of your motherboard box. You'll connect it to here just like that, and this will plug into one of your SATA drives on the motherboard. Let me turn it here. You see you've got plenty of them here. You can plug it to literally any single one of these, and you'll drop it right into there, and that's how your M.2 drive is powered. Now you can see why I said try not to get an M.2 drive on a small build like this, because look at all these cables, especially this one. This is just a Christmas tree of lights or just Christmas tree of cables, and it's just gonna be hanging in there versus an NVMe drive that's literally wireless. You don't see anything. It's just so much easier to do in a small drive or a small PC. Now for the power supply, you're gonna take the bracket that you took off earlier, and you're gonna go ahead and place it to line those holes. And just so that you guys know, it's gonna talk about these big beefy screws. These screws come with your power supply, not with your motherboard. There are a couple little screws that it's gonna tell you to install if you're using this case, and those little screws do come from the case, but again, your big beefy screws are gonna come from the power supply. Drop my power supply in, there's a couple things. One is that the cables are obviously out of the way, and 2 is that the PCI Express, the graphics card cable, it doesn't need to be on this side. As a matter of fact, when you put it in here, there's gonna be very, very, very little space on this bottom here, so you wanna do as much as here as you can, otherwise you're gonna have to take this apart. So you can route the PCI Express, the graphics card cable, I think down below, which is what I've done. And then one final thing that you need to make sure of is that the motherboard, the 24 pin, when I put it in here, I can see plenty of it, so I'll have plenty of space for that. But again, everything at the bottom is gonna get squished. So all the cables all the power supply cables you wanna put in here. So if you're gonna put a SATA drive, you want your SATA pins in here. Everything that was in our breadboarding is here. So this is our motherboard cable, this is our graphics card cable. But here's the one thing, remember the CPU cable? We pulled that out earlier. You wanna make sure you put that in, because otherwise you're not gonna have room to manipulate that later. So make sure you plug that in before you drop in that power supply. Now I'm gonna go ahead and move these cables out of the way so that everything can get tucked in. Let me do that. Turn these CPU cables, I'm gonna hide them underneath now because I know which direction needs to route. Let me flip this around. Okay, now that I've got the power supplies screwed in, there's a couple things that you gotta do. Remember that power slide thing or power slot thing that we had earlier? You're gonna route it and make sure you can plug it into here. And the biggest thing, guys, that a lot of people forget to do is they forget to turn on their power supply. So make sure you flip that on now because there's a good chance that you're gonna drive yourself crazy as to why your PC is not turning on later. So make sure you flick that on. And then the last thing we gotta do here is drop in our motherboard 24-pin cable. Like I said, I think I have pretty good visibility into that cable here. For the graphics card, I think it's gonna be easier if we actually plug in the cables before we plug anything in because there's very little clearance up here. So you're gonna go ahead and plug these cables in. Now make sure that they are flat when you put them in here. So in my case, I'm gonna have to twist this bottom a little bit so that when they come up here and spin down, they'll plug right in. Make sure this white pin is back, by the way, and you push down on that back side because there's a hole on the back side of this white piece that allows you to get that little plastic part in, and then push it down till you hear a little click, and then you can push this white part in to lock it in place. So it's supposed to go in this slot here, you stick it in, and it'll go into where you would typically screw the graphics card down in a typical motherboard, but you put it in this little hole here and you line it up to the holes on the graphics card. Then with the bigger block, you're gonna take this and put it on top, white metal part, put the graphics card metal on top, and then take the big block, put it on top, screw it in. My PC is all set together. Moment of truth, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it on. Oh, and make sure that your power supply is plugged in, your HDMI cable is plugged in. But for your HDMI cable, it's a little harder to tell here, but make sure it's in your graphics card and not your motherboard, okay? If you use the one that I have, it does not have a graphics card on it, so nothing will load. And we're good. All right, I'm not gonna install Windows here. Let's go ahead and install Windows upstairs on the golf simulator. So this is where the chaos happens. As you guys can see over here, I've got the PC set up. And over here is the keyboard that iQnix also sent over. I thought it matched really nicely with the case. So again, huge shout out to iQnix for sending both of these things over. And as you guys can see, there's no monitor here. Sorry, it's just a huge mess because my projector is functioning as my monitor. Later on, I'll put a monitor here and put like a webcam to track my form. But for now, this is what's going on. As you guys can see, I'm trying to install Windows right now. For those of you who don't know how to do that, all you need is some cheapo thumb drive like this. And what you're gonna do is you can Google create bootable Windows thumb drive and you go to a site from Microsoft. It's really easy. You download the program. It'll walk you through all the steps. Just make sure that there's nothing important in it because it will wipe the entire drive. And then you plug it into the back of your PC and you'll install. So a couple things, you don't need a Windows CD key. You can hit I don't have a product key, and the only thing you can't do is customization, like change the background and things like that. Otherwise, I believe it's totally functional. The other thing I forgot is that in my motherboard's box, there are two antennas because this motherboard has a Wi-Fi chip built in. Now, if you use the same one as me, you're gonna have those antennas as well. But if you're using a different motherboard, just make sure it's got Wi-Fi on it. If not, you're gonna need to buy some kind of USB Wi-Fi module. And the other thing you'll note is that on this computer, you see it doesn't have a signal. It's got that globe with that smaller thing on the bottom right to it. And what that means is this computer is not receiving any kind of internet signal. And the reason is because for any new build, it doesn't have any drivers. Like it doesn't have Wi-Fi drivers or software, the software needs to use Wi-Fi. And so while it was installing, I went to the manufacturer's website, installed the wireless driver onto this hard drive here. I'm gonna plug it in and install it, and I should have Wi-Fi. Yes! As you can see, this tiny PC is more than enough power to power all the golf simulators out there. On SkyTrak, it auto set the graphics level at the maximum, whereas on TGC 2019, it set it one lower than the maximum at high versus ultra. So this is how you build a tiny PC for $750, about the same price as you would pay for an iPad Pro, but it can run every single golf simulator software out there. Let me know if you guys want benchmarks on other games as well, and I'll leave that in the comments down below. Until next time, guys, stay safe, and as always, stay honest.